Well, if this is God's country, and I do think it is, I'm really glad he didn't get confused in the confusion between Hat Creek and Sage Creek, because someone asked me to explain the reason why there's all this Hat Creek stuff, because the creek right over here is Sage Creek. And when the soldiers very first arrived here, they were supposed to be on Hat Creek, which is over in Nebraska. This is where they landed. Nobody knows if it was intentional or a true mistake. But words do matter, because now we still, all these years later, have Hat Creek on Sage Creek. So, Danny and Jeb, do you want to come do Hanson Family?
Do it glory.
Okay. Okay. And Donna. And is this what you meant, Jeb?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to start by talking about Frank Hanson, who is Danny and Jeb's grandfather. He was born in Illinois in 1870, the youngest of 12 children. When he was still very young, the family moved to Tecumseh, Nebraska, and settled near Silver Creek. At about 2.5 years old, he nearly drowned when he was following his older siblings across the creek and fell in only to be saved by one of his sisters. At age 11, Frank's brother-in-law, Jim Olinger, was attending school in the winter, and his other brother, OJ, worked in Wyoming and visited home. Another brother, Red, was heading back to Wyoming, and Frank begged to join him. With a little money, the two traveled by foot and hitched rides until they reached Sidney, Nebraska, where they stayed briefly before continuing west. Frank recalled buying a cowboy hat and six-shooters, though he had little cowboy experience at first. From Sidney, they traveled toward Fort Laramie, alternating between walking and horseback. Frank struggled with his hat blowing away in the wind and often had to chase it, nearly losing it in the Platte River. Red frequently rode while Frank walked, forcing the boy to struggle along. Actually, they did ride and tie. Along the way, they stayed at the 4P Ranch, where Frank hoped to begin work. At the 4P, Lewis Davis was foreman, and Frank was promised work beginning in May. Until then, he lingered with the cowboys, observing their life. When the work didn't materialize, he hired on at the PF Ranch, digging ditches for a few weeks before quitting due to disputes among the crew. He then drifted back to Nebraska, covering long miles on foot, and by the time he returned, he was exhausted but determined. Frank continued finding seasonal jobs. He worked cultivating corn near Tecumseh, and the following winter experienced a great blizzard of 1888 while staying with Jim Olinger. Later, he followed Red again, this time to Node, Wyoming, where he was introduced to John B. Kendrick. He gave him a first steady cowboy job at $25 a month. After that, his wages were raised to $30 a month, and we think it's because he didn't drink and was very cautious, unlike his descendants. His early cowboy years were full of challenges. Horses often bucked, and he had to prove himself. He worked under various outfits, including the OW Ranch, where he was part of large roundups. He also worked for Tom Abbott and later for the LX and UT outfits, moving with cattle across Wyoming, Nebraska, and the Dakotas. Frank recalled broncs and balky horses, giving him plenty of rough rides, but these experiences hardened him into a skilled cowboy. Life on the range was unpredictable. Frank endured harsh winters, including being snowed in while traveling with cattle. On one trip, he lost his way in a snowstorm and narrowly survived the cold, finding shelter in a sheep camp. He described riding through deep snow, nearly freezing, and eventually thawing out among strangers. Actually, he suffered damage to his arms and feet and never was able to do quite as much. During the 1890s, Frank's work took him across vast stretches of country. In 1890, he joined the LX outfit as an all-steer outfit during the Indian Scare. He wintered in Buffalo and rode with crews driving cattle north and west. In 1891 and 1892, he worked for the UT outfit and later took part in the Johnson County War era, though he focused mainly on his cattle work. He recalled running herds for miles without fences, often sleeping rough and riding long days. In 1893, his experience had grown, and he was trusted with difficult jobs. He took cattle from the Missouri River to Sandstone Creek, camping along the way and facing storms. He described snow so deep it buried shacks and forced men to improvise to survive. Despite hardships, he pressed on with his work, continuing to hire on with outfits like the OW and LX, and enduring blizzards, isolation, and the ever-presence of what a cowboy does, the ever-present danger. In 1894, he worked on Hanging Woman Creek. In 1895, he pushed cattle as far north as the Canadian line. At that time, there were 3 cowboys named Frank with the outfit, so he earned the nickname Big Frank. Frank's story reflects the toughness required of early cowboys: long miles on foot and horseback, brutal winters, dangerous broncs, and unpredictable pay. Through it all, he built his reputation as a reliable working hand. What began as a boy's dream of adventure turned into years of hard labor and survival on the open range, shaping him into the man remembered in this memoir. Frank married Catherine Kate Dorsey in 1905. Frank had already used his homestead rights for a homestead for Tom Bell that he sold back to Tom Bell. So Kate homesteaded at the home place on Young Woman, where Frank had already built a cabin. And this was in 1905. His great-grandson, Ben Frank, and his family presently live at the original home place. Frank and Kate had 2 children, Dan, born in 1906, and Sadie in 1907. Kate was a wonderful partner. She was a mover and a doer. She was instrumental in helping her family grow their holdings.
I'm going to carry down the next generation here. My father, Dan Burke Hanson, was born February 4th, 1906 in Lusk, Wyoming, which at that time was in Converse County. His sister, Sadie, was born in 1907. Interesting enough, they had telephone service at that time. It went as far as the Young Woman Creek at that time. In 1911, Dan's half-sister, Margaret Dorsey, taught him how to read and write. Dan and Sadie's mother, Kate, was a firm believer in education, and she was very instrumental, like Donna just said, in getting rural schools established in the area. Dan started school at the Klaus family homestead, which was 5 miles west of his home. Dan and Sadie attended several different schools in that area. As homesteaders moved in, they just kind of moved those schools around. And it's kind of my observation that the homesteaders worked hard to keep the riding distance for the students to less than 6 miles. He could remember the adults talking about the war over in Europe, and they all agreed that the United States should stay out of the war, and there were just about as many people thought that France ought to win as Germany. And then Woodrow Wilson was re-elected on the promise to keep us out of the war, and it's a promise he didn't keep. I guess the politicians haven't changed much. He attended country schools until 1922, when he finished his last 2 years of high school in Lusk. In those days, a lot of the country schools would teach some freshman and sophomore years. And he played on the first Lusk football team. When he attended high school, the place he attended high school is where the Elks Lodge is now. And there were approximately 100 students at that time, and now there are only about 80. In 1925, Dan attended Laramie College. While in college, he chopped wood, peeled potatoes at a boarding house for his board and room. He received his teaching certificate in 6 weeks. He began his teaching career at Van Tassel. And of course, his transportation was with a horse, and he got $90 a month. It was 6 hours ride from Van Tassel back to the home place, so he stayed up there during the week. He rode that same saddle that he bought for $40 with his first paycheck. He rode it until he couldn't ride anymore. That's his saddle right over there. He had it re-rigged at least 3 or 4 times, a lot of patches. The stirrups are made out of brass, so they would break when the horse fell instead of crushed like a wooden stirrup would. And you see a lot of places it was brazed where it was broken. In 1930, he taught at Carbon Black at Lance Creek. When Carbon Black blew up, he was right there writing lessons in the morning for the day's work at school. And all of a sudden, the wall bulged in a little bit, and he heard a huge explosion. And he hurried out the door and looked to see what was going on. And there was a man and his son were just staggering around, and huge timbers this big were just raining down all around them, just like in some cartoons you've seen. But they didn't get hurt, but they were looking for a gas leak, and they needed to see a little better, so they lit a match, and they found it. During that time he's at Carbon Black, he filed for a Democratic ticket for the legislature, and much to his surprise, he was elected. In 1931, the Lance Creek School Board found a substitute for Dan's teaching position, and this tall, gangly 24-year-old headed for Cheyenne. He lost the next election because he had too many no votes on spending money. About 15 years later, Dan was approached by the Niobrara County delegates to ask if he would make another run for the office. His reply, "The Democrat Party have gone way over to the left and left me behind." Needless to say, he did not run again. The one thing he learned about his stay in Cheyenne was power corrupts and absolute power absolutely corrupts. In May of 1943, my father was married Margaret Brock. An interesting side note, she could never understand why men like to wear neckties. Her father, J. Elmer Brock, said he knew just the man for her since he met my father at various stock grower meetings. After they were married, Dan and Margaret moved to the Haydu place. It's roughly 2 miles north of the home place. And it was acquired shortly before that. To this marriage was born 6 children: John, Kathy, Brock, myself, Julie, and Jeb. All but 2 of the children were born in Lusk. In 1954, my mother's father, J. Elmer, passed away. Consequently, Dan and Margaret bought out their brother or her brother's share of the ranch, and the whole family moved to KC. At that point, Dan continued to run the ranches. Spec Black was the Lusk ranch foreman until 1980, when Dan Jr. took over. Through the years, Dan and his children and grandchildren had added to the holdings of both the Lusk and KC ranches. Dan Jr.'s sons, Dan and Ben, are currently running the Cross Age Ranch. Jeb also runs a ranch in Niobrara County on part of the original ranch. His daughters are involved with helping him as well as running their Lamb-Cammer grandparents' ranch. Dan Sr.'s other 4 children and some of their children run the ranch at KC. Dan and Margaret had 6 children, 10 grandchildren, and 24 great-grandchildren. Thank you.
I don't have a whole lot to add to that, except I was lucky enough I knew Ed Bryant, and I live over here on the Bryant place. And I'm not going to tell his whole story, but I would recommend that everybody that's interested in this area read his book, Hat Creek and Homesteads. It's really good, and I got to know him. I was pretty lucky that way, and I asked him what the biggest changes were, and the one that kind of struck me was when he was a kid, he did a lot of trapping for muskrats, but they weren't supposed to trap beavers. And there were beaver dams all over. And he said there were hundreds of acres of beaver dams on the creek, especially down by the mill ranch and down through there. And I try to imagine what it must have been like. Even some of these draws that came up had beaver dams in them that are dry now. Another thing that changed, there must not have been many cattle guards back then. And I think about my grandmother on my dad's side. We all knew them that are my age, the women that were born in the 1800s, and they all wore a dress and an apron, and none of them ever did drive a car. And I don't think my grandmother ever rode a horse, but they had a little 2-wheel buggy and a little paint horse named Indian, and that's how she would get here to Hat Creek, was with that 2-wheel buggy. And that horse Indian would get her here and back pretty good. And the only other thing I have is I got to admit, when I first moved here in about 90, I guess it was, I was invited to a party at well, we just call it the school. I think Danny calls it they call it the clubhouse. And I was invited to a doings there, and there were women and men there, and got to talking, and it was kind of in loosely parliamentary procedure, and the next thing I knew, I got elected president. So I asked, well, what is the name of this that I'm the president of? And it's the Hat Creek Women's Club. And well, what do you do? And I think they knew I don't play cards. And they said, well, we play cards. So maybe that was a kind of a roundabout way of ending the whole deal, because I'm still waiting for orders. And that's been quite a long time ago. And I wasn't going to tell that part, but I spilled the beans earlier, so today. So anyway, that's all I have. So thanks.